Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how I transformed this shimpaku juniper from this to this. So let's get started. This work was completed between January 8th to 10th of 2023. I'll share some background information as we go, but for now let's take a closer look. I thought this tree would look really cool if we could fold it in half, bending this straight section of the trunk. But in order to do so, this deadwood had to be removed. Afterwards, I'll carve the live tissue, brace it, and bend it, trying to keep the bend as smooth as possible. Turning it around, you can see that the live vein is nearly flat, so it should be pretty flexible once the deadwood is cut out. This here is the back side of the tree, which will become the new front. To remove the deadwood, I'm going to go in and cut out as much as I can with some branch splitters, a pair of old concave cutters, and a small handsaw. This step will be done pretty roughly and is just to reduce the deadwood to a couple millimeters above the live vein to prevent cutting too deep or tearing the live tissue out with the deadwood. At this point, the bulk of the deadwood has been cut out and there's a thin amount remaining, which I'll carve out a little bit slower with some sharper carving tools to be a little more precise. If only the deadwood is removed, the trunk will have a U shape to it instead of being flat, so I'll carve down these curved edges of the live vein, try to flatten it. If it's not flattened more, these curved edges will be reinforcing the trunk against the direction I want to bend it. I'm carving down to the live tissue now with some gouges. This could also be done with some power tools such as a Dremel to save time, however I'm not going to get dust all over the workshop just to save a few minutes. I want the inside to be as smooth and as flat as it can be, eliminating any and all deadwood that could be causing stiffness or even potentially puncture the live tissue during the bend. You can tell when you've reached the live tissue by the change of color and the texture. It's much softer and your tools will start to glide through as you're carving. Here with the deadwood totally removed, you can see the light color of the living tissue. The remaining deadwood at the top and the bottom can be carved to shape once the bend is healed in several months. From the side, you can tell just how thin this live vein really is. The flexibility can be judged easily now, but I won't try anything until I have it braced. And the first step to that is laying some aluminum wire along the inner face, shaping it to fill the channels. Now it's time to wrap. The first layer will be this strip of gasket rubber, which can be found online or at a hardware store. You can buy whatever size is suitable to the application. In the past, I've only done large bends with raffia, but after failing a smaller trunk bend on a tree last summer, I wanted to try other materials. This rubber is quite stiff, and stretching it onto the trunk, you can feel it compressing the wood firmly as it's trying to return to its original shape. It's a little difficult to see here, but an important thing to note is that with each wrap of the rubber, I'm stuffing in some wet sphagnum moss. This accomplishes two things. It'll fill any remaining gaps between the trunk and the wire, preventing anything from shifting or creating space for breakage. Secondly, it provides moisture along the exposed tissue, which is beneficial for healing any cracks or separations which may occur. As with everything here, I'm taking my time to wrap as evenly as I can in regards to both tension and spacing. I fasten it tightly at the top with yellow electrical tape to mark roughly how far I need to go with the next material, which is this batten tape commonly found in Japan and used for anchoring down greenhouses. It's flexible, but it's almost unstretchable, which I've learned makes it almost ideal for using in big bends to compress branches and in this case the trunk. I can't take credit entirely for this choice, as I took inspiration from Seth Nelson, who's studying at Aichien in Nagoya, and recommended using it for a situation like this. Similar tapes can be found online, so be sure to experiment with what works best for you. When applying this, you have to keep constant and consistent tension, so I keep one hand holding the tension while the other hand passes it over and under. Of course you want to apply this as tightly as you can. But because it doesn't stretch, the only way the tension will give out is if you accidentally push back against the direction you're going. So it's not too bad if you need to adjust your position along the way. If you end up with some blisters on your hands, that means you're doing it right. Perhaps you're wondering why I'm using both the batten tape and the rubber. I used the combination because I was concerned that a bend this extreme that the tape might separate from itself slightly as I bend, which could create space for the trunk to stretch or break. This way the rubber is providing a full coverage around the live vein, and additionally makes it easier and safer to apply the batten tape tightly to the trunk. Now it's wrapped on. For security's sake, I've applied it a bit further in both directions from where the bend will be made. I finish it off by tying it under itself and wrapping some black electrical tape around the end. You can see that it's been wrapped evenly all the way up the length of the trunk. Lastly, I wrap the trunk with a 6-gauge copper wire. Since I'll be doing the bend alone, I'll only be using guy wires to manipulate the trunk into place. And if any of those snap, slip, or just give out during the process, the thick wire will prevent the trunk from swinging back violently. This is safer for both me and the tree itself. This wire will be secured at the base between the roots and around the bend at the top. There's really no one method fits all when doing a bend like this. Invoking your inner MacGyver and carefully considering how you stage everything will certainly affect the end result. It's important to be safe, enjoy it, and at all costs protect the tree, especially when things don't go as planned. To get the bend going, you saw I hammered in some rebar. Luckily, the soil's clogged up enough and it holds these bars secure. Alternatively, these could have been secured to the pot or the tree itself, but this seemed to be the easiest choice at the time. I'm going to be doing this bend in a few phases. First, bending the top section towards the planned back side of the tree, and from there down towards the front, bending along the silver bar on the inside of the bend to keep it smooth without a single point taking all of the stress. Instead of just cranking it aggressively by hand, I'll guide it slowly with the guy wires into position. You can see I finally have it all rigged up, and I check to make sure it's still going to be flexible enough with all these extra layers. I'm much more used to having my hands on the branch while doing a big bend like this and being able to feel its limits. Using that experience and giving a few test bends, I'm trying to judge if the protection will be sufficient. After a few minutes and a few deep breaths, I'm ready to start. But before we get to that, if you're enjoying this, give a like to the video, and if you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe. The first phase is to bring everything straight back, using a thick guy wire to inch it along rather than forcing it by hand. Once it reaches the first bar, I have a better angle to get another wire from the top of the tree and pull that towards the root base. The trunk is now bent about 90 degrees, which would have been impossible with the dead wood and would have certainly been beyond the limit without wrapping the trunk. Now I'm assessing the best position for the next guy wire. I typically don't like to have the guy wire do the work of the bend, but I think with a thick enough wire and a proper anchor point, as long as it doesn't bind or damage the tree, it's proven to be quite useful when doing a bend alone. As predicted, the batten tape has started to separate a bit, and I'm officially putting my trust in the rubber underneath. I backed up the bend slightly and temporarily put a rubber block along the stress point, and then pushed a bit further from there. Now I have to focus on spreading out the bend along the rest of the length of the trunk. I was pretty worried about that separation and how much stress might be on that single point. No matter which way the tape was wrapped, it would still separate just because the bend is so deep in multiple directions. So the next morning, I decided to cut a notch into this eyelet rod so that the top portion could bend down and around it instead of just being stuck horizontally. The block wasn't really doing its job, and it would have been an eyesore anyway. Using some newly positioned guy wires, I can pull the top straight down towards the root base. And as I always try to keep my rigging as neat as possible when the job is completed, instead of leaving a big piece of wire and padding on the roots, I decide to hammer in another eyelet rod, and after several considerations, I determined that hammering one in between those roots will allow me to get the best angle for the final position, and it won't be blocking anything in front of the tree. After it's secure, I can remove the 6-gauge wire. And before I wire out the branches, I wanted to compress the top of the trunk a little more to reel in the foliage mass and compact the design, having the apex right about here. Here it is before we get the wire on the rest of the tree. While I wire down all these spaghetti branches, I'd like to share the short story about how this tree came to be. My teacher Fujikawa-san had gone out one day alone last May to go buy some trees, and usually this means he'll just come back with 2 or 3. But that time, he came back with a half-full van of surprisingly low to mid-range quality trees, which he got for a very low price. Originally, when I saw this tree, I kind of wrote it off. I didn't think the root base worked well with the trunk line. It felt really unbalanced being such a long tree with exposed roots, and I wasn't very impressed with the foliage quality either. It wasn't very healthy at the time, so there wasn't too much to be done with it. A few weeks later, it was rotated to get sun on the front side, and I thought that I really liked the movement in the root base from the back. I brought it inside and took a few pictures of both sides, and I had a really aha moment. I did a few rough sketches with pencil and then took some measurements the next day. I made sure that the top of the tree would sit above the root base nicely if I were to bend it around. So now that I really wanted to do that, I had to convince my teacher to let me risk doing this. I'm not a great artist, but I got out the markers and drew a pretty convincing drawing of how I predicted it could turn out. I had to make sure that it looked a lot more expensive than it did in its previous state. As is clear from this video, he allowed it, but he said wait until winter to do the work. Over the next 8 months, I made it my mission to get the tree back into good health, aerating the soil, and keeping tight control on the watering and fertilization. It was left outside until the work was performed so that it was in proper dormancy. After the work was completed, it was placed in the storage room to protect it from the cold, and it was misted twice daily, once in the morning and once in the evening. It's a really tricky process to wire down an apex with really long branches like this. In order to get a clean result, one of the best things I think you can do is always bend the branches in unison. You can see they all kind of flow in the same direction, and I always try to minimize randomness. Structure like this is often encountered on old and neglected trees. It's not perfect, but it's one of the scenarios you learn to deal with after wiring trees for several years. Coming up to the end, let's see a quick before and after. And a little comparison with my drawing. How'd I do? A bit different, but it's pretty close. I think the outcome's still pretty interesting, and I learned a lot. Thanks for tuning in to watch me wrestle with the bonsai. If you enjoyed it or learned something new yourself, please give a like and share. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe. If you want to share your perspective or yell at me for abusing plants, I'll see you in the comments. Here it is, back outside at the beginning of spring. You can see the colors returned, and I think this tree has a great future. Lastly, if you want to support my work, please feel free to contribute a donation either through YouTube or the link in the description. Anything helps, and it'll always go towards making better content for you all. Whether that's buying better equipment or bonsai to demonstrate with, I'll forever be a student of this beautiful craft. I want to share what I learn as I go and spread the joy of bonsai. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.